endorse the previous acknowledgements to country. As said, I have been associated with the Marrickville Peace Group for over a decade, but recently I've moved to Wentworth Falls, but I still want to carry on my opposition to what Israel is doing in Palestine and the West Bank. Now, I've got a few pages to read, so I hope you can bear with me. In recent weeks, is that right? Can you hear me? Okay. In recent weeks, the UN and humanitarian agencies have warned that the people in northern Gaza are facing imminent famine as a result of Israel's total blockade. Before Israel's war on Gaza began, 50% of people in the besieged enclave were food insecure and 80% depended on humanitarian aid. Since the onset of hostilities and the ramping up of Israel's blockade, every single person in Gaza is now going hungry. 1/4 of the population are starving, and famine is imminent. Even more concerning is the fact that children are starting to die from malnutrition, starvation, and dehydration. All children, this is incredible, all children under the age of 5, that's 335,000 children, are at risk of severe malnutrition and famine. 70% of children are now suffering from diarrhoea, and 90% of children under the age of 5 are affected by one or more infectious diseases. This dire situation also imperils the future of people in Gaza, in the sense that there is a high risk of children becoming stunted. This involves permanent cognitive and physical impairment in the future. Linked to this deplorable situation is the Israeli government's policy of deliberately destroying Gaza's food system. Not only are Israeli forces blocking access to Palestinians to their farmlands and the sea, they are also destroying orchards, greenhouses and farmland. As a result, humanitarian agencies have warned that there is a high risk of a complete agricultural collapse in Gaza by May this year if the situation continues. As well, Israel has denied fishers access to the sea since October of last year. Gaza lies adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea, so fishing has always been a crucial part of their way of life. According to UN reports, Israel has already destroyed approximately 70% of Gaza's fishing fleet. In the last week, 2 fishers were killed in Khan Yunis, and about 20 days ago, 4 fishers were killed in Rafah. No wonder humanitarian organisations have highlighted the dire consequences of food insecurity imposed on Gaza by the Israeli government, a war crime. I briefly have outlined some of the dimensions of the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza because I wanted to provide context to news bulletins broadcast yesterday concerning the latest atrocity committed by Israeli forces. This relates to the IDF indiscriminately firing upon civilians in northern Gaza who were surrounding a convoy of trucks carrying food supplies. Details are still sketchy, but the Hamas-run health agency reported that over 100 Palestinians were killed and many hundreds were injured. This now adds to the Palestinian death toll in Gaza of over 30,000, with over 70,000 injured. How many Palestinians lie dead under tons of rubble as a result of the IDF's saturation bombing since last October is unknown. So who organised this food convoy? Well, it emerged that the food convoy was organised by none other than an Israeli government agency. Israel authorities admitted that the IDF opened fire on the desperate civilians who hadn't received any food aid for months as a result of Israel government's deliberate blockade of all food supplies entering northern Gaza. In the chaos surrounding the incident, Israeli authorities claimed that the IDF fired upon civilians because, wait for it, they feel threatened. There, that is, threatened by defenceless, starving civilians. Besides that, Israel authorities laid most of the blame for dozens of deaths on a stampede that ensued, as well as on trucks running over civilians that were swarming around the combat. Israel has vowed to investigate this latest incident. This will be a farce, as all similar Israeli investigations into IDF murderous operations have been, and there will be no consequences for those responsible for this latest atrocity. Now, as a result of interviews yesterday with experienced aid workers familiar with the dangers of delivering food to starving populations in such desperate, insecure environment, was not undertaken by Israel. I'd just like to quote Jeremy Conendine, President of Refugees International, who said that the usual planning and coordination needed for distributing food in such circumstances was not undertaken by Israel. Jeremy also correctly emphasised that the larger story behind this incident involves the following, and I quote, "The Israeli government has been actively creating a situation of extreme desperation in northern Gaza now for months. They have been preventing and handicapping the professional humanitarians who could have been overriding and sustaining a lifeline of aid into this region so that people would not reach this level of desperation. Having completely undermined the system," he said, "the Israeli government is now trying to reverse engineer food aid without really knowing what it's doing. The indiscriminate shooting of civilians resulted." I'd like to briefly refer to a few other remarks made by Jeremy Conendine in response to Joe Biden's claim that this latest event will complicate current ceasefire talks. Jeremy said it's hard to know what the impact will be. However, the larger problem, he said, is this. The US government has so far refused to put any meaningful pressure on the Netanyahu government over its war on Gaza. While on the one hand, the US administration publicly urges the Israeli government to allow unfettered humanitarian access and protect civilians from harm, they have totally failed to fully enforce either of these things. As well, there were no real consequences for failing to implement this. Jeremy went on to say, "What we see is the culmination of these two failures coming together. The failure to impose any kind of consequences for extensive civilian harm, and the failure to impose any kind of consequences for the rotting of humanitarian aid. It is the combination of these twin failures that have produced the latest tragedy in northern Gaza." Finally, I'd like to comment on Australia's stance on Gaza since last October. During the initial weeks of the war, the Albanese government failed to condemn Israel's wholesale assault on Gaza and call for an immediate and lasting ceasefire. In response to a UN resolution in late October that called for a ceasefire, what happened? Well, the Albanese government abstained from voting. Only weeks of protests in Australia and around the world did the Albanese government back the UN resolution in December, calling for a ceasefire and the resumption of unfettered humanitarian aid. On this occasion, Australia joined 152 other nations in voting in favour of this resolution. When South Africa lodged an application with the ICJ, International Court of Justice, at the end of December, alleging genocide by Israel in Gaza, the Albanese government failed to lend support to this application. Again, on the 26th of January, when the ICJ found that South Africa's case had plausibility, Australia failed to welcome this finding. Nor did it call upon Israel to comply with the ICJ's interim order, requiring it to abide by to abide by the Genocide Convention, stop its assault on civilians, and allow the resumption of adequate humanitarian aid. Throughout the 5 months of carnage and the deliberate destruction of Palestinian society and culture, the Albanese government has made no demands on the US to end its complicity with Israel. Shame.
Shame.
Apart from providing diplomatic cover for Israel, the US is Israel's main supplier of weapons. Without this massive supply of weapons, Israel would not sustain this genocidal war on Gaza. Australia's ambassador to the UN, James Larson, observed that Australia's position on Israel's war on Gaza has undergone an evolution. He's certainly right about that. It's also the case that past demonstrations and protests held around the country have helped bring about this diplomatic evolution, of course. One thing is for sure, historically, this episode in Australian diplomacy will not go down as one of the country's finest. Congratulations to the organisers of this rally and to everyone who has participated today and in past rallies. Congratulations also to Greens councillors for getting a motion calling for a ceasefire and sanctions endorsed recently by the Blue Mountains Council. The pressure on the Albanese government to act more decisively and fulfil Australia's obligations under the Genocide Convention, after all they are a signatory, needs to be sustained. Free Palestine.